It tasted good, but was mostly fluff. The hot dogs looked interesting, so he mashed a couple. Boring. The clam fritter he sniffed smelled like puke. Disgusting. After throwing some popcorn around, George tasted the caramel syrup. Not bad, but he needed something with more substance, something he could build on. Candy apples might do, thought George. Of course, I'll build the ultimate candy apple, he thought excitedly. It would be legendary, a timeless creation for the annals of posterity. Whatever. He pried a starter apple off the wax paper and rolled it in a nut bowl. Beautiful, what a start. Next came candy sprinkles, and then he jammed it with spice drops. Bitchin', but something was missing. George looked around, spotting some heavy canisters of whipped cream. This would be the ultimate topping for his nonpareil candy apple. He grabbed a canister and pulled the trigger, but nothing came out. "Ain't this a pisser?" he chattered, shaking the canister violently. He hugged the canister, rolling around on the floor, sucking at the nozzle. Pressure was building, small pops and hisses were escaping from the canister nozzle. Using his monkey grip, George held the canister firmly, then shook and shook. Meanwhile, George noticed that the food attendant's eyes were latched hypnotically on bloody Potty's ass. The dumb fuck was leaning over the counter, completely tranced. Bombs wouldn't break the spell. The pointless slut was dressed gangbanger style too, with a huge pair of pants, hitched down to where his coin slot was exposed. Showtime, thought George. He cradled the whipped cream canister in one arm, then crept up behind the idiot. Slowly, carefully, he slipped the nozzle into the coin slot, squeezed the trigger and whoosh. The pants ballooned out gigantically and the attendant, realizing a sort of seizure, started a wacky turkey trot with his arms akimbo. "I'm banging with the Crips," shouted George, running in circles around his mark, who by now was rabid and chasing George around the concession with whipped cream flowing from the bottom of his trousers. "What up, man?" shouted George. "I say, what's buzzing, cousin? Can't catch the creeper 'cause he be the quickest thing in the hood." Grabbing his candy apple, George shot out the door and bounced straight off Drexel Puss's prodigious cut. "I say, sir, just stand aside," insisted George. "Begging your pardon, sir, but do allow me passage," he continued. "Get your fat, motherfucking ass out of my path, blob boy," shouted George. But Puss's slimy hands were reaching for George's throat. The man in the pork pie hat knew that if he didn't bring George back into the fold, it meant trouble. First, he'd have to explain the situation to George's publisher and, with the latest installment, titled Curious George Loses His Winter Jacket, already in schedule, the guy would shit bricks. Then there was the movie deal, the public clamoring for George's next release. Filming hadn't even begun, and most of George's signing bonus had already been pissed away. "I'd be ruined," thought the man, "my reputation shot." He was sitting at the kitchen table, his face buried mournfully in the palms of his hands. "There's no one else to blame," thought he. "I brought this whole goddamn business down on myself, laid too hard into the bottle, gave in to George's every whim, and now the entire thing has turned sour. That's not the way it used to be, and, goddamn it, that's not the way it is now," bringing his fist on the table with new resolve. He'd been a fool to even consider ending it all, a sucker to let a bottle of rot gut ruin his body and muddle his thinking. Well, all that was over now. The kid was back, just like George would be back, whatever the cost. The man stood up confidently and walked to the garage, rolling out Mary, his Vincent Black shadow. She had a stiff compression, but he got up high on the kickstart and Mary woke up growling. Drexel Puss's hand closed around George's throat with the finality of a bear trap. The pig was demonically strong and George's struggles were in vain. Bloody Potty attacked the fat fuck from the rear, but her feminine little fists were useless against the brute, who slapped her aside and continued to throttle George. His great jiggling tonnage leaned in and George began to see black. Suddenly, Puss started dragging George toward his repulsive lair. "The skin horse." "Bring the skin horse," gasped George. Bloody Potty sensed through instinct the terrible fate that awaited George at the hands of Pusser. The misshapen pig would do something horrible for sure. She must bring the skin horse. Only the skin horse could derail George's fate. Already, her feet were running for the carnival exit, for the skin horse's stables. The man in the pork pie hat had little trouble picking up George's path of mischief. Outraged citizens responded to his questions with alacrity, pointing fingers in the direction they'd last seen the little Dickens. He'd tracked George's movements to "It's a Monkey Thing" and was inside, listening patiently as the salesman listed complaints over George's behavior and demanded the return of his wallet, which he swore on the health of his children that George had stolen. The man paid restitution, throwing in an extra $5 for psychological battery, and then, on a hunch, pointed Mary towards the outskirts of town and Wacky World. Bloody Potty had done her level best in reaching the skin horse's stables quickly. Her big tits heaved volcanically as she burst, barefoot and tattered, into the skin horse's stall. "George is in trouble," she choked. "A huge, gross man has captured him in a carnival called Wacky World." The skin horse's ears pricked up at this information, the awesome slabs and corded knots of his muscle becoming ready. "Does this man have a face like as much fecal matter?" asked he. "Then you know the monster," rejoined Bloody. "Yes," said the skin horse, "and know no good of him. In repulsiveness, he is unparalleled, in his evil unmatched. He is the consummate geek and there is no time to waste." Bloody leapt astride his noble back and, like the wind, they flew toward Wacky World. Whenever the man in the pork pie hat appeared in public, a Pied Piper effect ensued. He was wandering around Wacky World looking for signs of George, and he had a string of happy children in tow. "Are you really the real man in the pork pie hat?" asked a bashful-looking 6-year-old. The man smiled kindly at the boy. "Yes, son, I am really the real man in the pork pie hat," he said proudly. "Gee and wow, hey everybody, it's the man in the pork pie hat. You remember, from the Curious George books?" "But where is George?" they all asked. "That's just what I was hoping to find out," said the man to his group of fans, which was getting bigger every moment. "The word on the street is that George was last seen heading in this direction," said the man. Suddenly the crowd parted and the coconut stepped forward. Harold was close behind. "It must have been George that pissed on my head a little earlier this evening. He sure is the Dickens," she giggled. "Heck, I love Curious George." "Who doesn't?" agreed Harold. "Nobody doesn't," said the coconut. "Let's start a search," yelled everyone together. Within minutes all the people spread out in a collective effort to find the world's coolest monkey. But none of them, not even the man in the pork pie hat, could hear the muffled cries for help leaking from behind the locked, reinforced door of Drexel Puss's trailer. Bloody Potty arrived suddenly on the scene, sitting atop the skin horse, who was covered in lather from the record pace he'd maintained. "The trailer," she cried, "the trailer. Get to the trailer." Inside the trailer, the inconceivable was about to happen. Suffice it to say that Pusser was sharpening his carving knives and a large pot, teeming with small furry carcasses, was boiling on the stove. George struggled valiantly against the burlap bag he'd been thrust into, but to no avail. Outside the trailer, the coconut and Harold, together with the man in the pork pie hat, were wasting precious moments trying to understand Bloody's hysterics. "What about the trailer?" asked the frustrated Harold. "Yes, what of it?" demanded the coconut. "Is George in danger?" asked the man. Bloody gulped a breath, shook her head violently in the affirmative, and the crowd rushed at the trailer as if French revolutionaries storming the Bastille. Try as they might, though, they could not cause the trailer door to give way, and heedless of the riot outside, Pusser continued in his terrible industry. "Get the skin horse," yelled the coconut, and the skin horse was led before the trailer door. Without thought, he reared up, mightily bringing down his furious hooves against the door, which breached inward, torn to shreds from the awesome power of his blow. In rushed the man, raining stultifying punches about the head and shoulders of Drexel Pusser. On came the coconut, Harold and Bloody, scratching and slapping, causing the big asshole to howl in pain and beg for mercy. Mercy was granted, but only after a protracted ass-whipping, an even longer period of verbal derision, and assurances from Pusser that never again would he think to abuse animals or people. "So help me God," dictated the man in the pork pie hat. "So help me God," repeated Pusser, though a little disgruntled. "It's settled then," said Bloody Potty with great assurance. "Settled," said the skin horse. "All is well," said the coconut, nodding her fuzzy head ecstatically. Harold just stood there with his shoulders back and his chest out, smiling wide. "All is well," said the man, turning to George and taking him by the hand. "Except for one thing, and that's your behavior, George. You have been a very naughty little monkey indeed." "I know," sighed George with a sheepish smile. Together again, George and the man in the pork pie hat climbed aboard Mary, who was basking in the embers of the rising sun. George hugged his friend, smiling contentedly. It was going to be an excellent day.